First and importantly, welcome, and I wish to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, in my case, the Wurundjeri people. I pay my respects to Aboriginal elders past and present, and to leaders yet to emerge, and acknowledge the land was never ceded. I also note the need to work with and to help elevate the voices of First Nations peoples who are opposed to the use of their land for military purposes. Welcome, friends. My name is Kellie Tranter. I'm a lawyer, researcher and chair of the Independent and Peaceful Australia Inquiry, which is a national public inquiry into the costs and consequences of the Australia-US alliance for the Australian people. I would like to thank IPAN, particularly Annette Brownlee and Sam Brennan, for helping to organise and coordinate the webinar this evening. Before I begin, I wish to remind people to turn mute on. Please put your questions in the chat, and as a matter of courtesy, please do not interrupt our speakers, because the intention is to conclude on time at 7 p.m. because of the many other Thursday night commitments I'm sure many of you have. I recognise that this webinar has, with very good reason, generated a great deal of interest. If you have an important question that you would like to put to our panellists but time prevents us from getting to it, rest assured that we'll pass it on to them. And finally, a reminder that the webinar is being recorded. I just wanted to very quickly give you an update on the inquiry. I'm very pleased to say that hundreds of submissions were received, which is excellent. Although public submissions have now closed, submissions from the panellists are still welcome if time permits. Recurring themes and consistent messages have emerged from the submissions. One theme that certainly stands out is that war is a choice rather than an inevitability in defence and foreign policy decisions, and the consequences of those choices can be grave. The inquiry's findings, when published, will be of considerable historical significance. First, as an historical reference point for those who in the future will assess the efficacy of our government's decisions and actions. And secondly, as a clarion call for the use of reason, diplomacy, and the common sense of the electorate and all of our elected representatives in making decisions about alliances and warfare in what really are Australia's best interests. All going well, the report will be published and launched in February. For more information or further updates, you can head to the People's Inquiry website or submit any questions you may have to IPAN. Turning now to the theme of tonight's webinar, which is Australia's involvement in the invasion of Afghanistan. Our first speaker is Diana Sayad. Diana is the Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Muslim Women's Centre for Human Rights. She joined the organisation as an international human rights lawyer with experience both in Australia and the United States. Diana has appeared as a regular panellist on The World, SBS, Al Jazeera, MSNBC and Q&A. She must be famous if she's been on Q&A. With a Master in International Human Rights Law, she is an expert on the issues of gender equality, social justice and human rights. She's worked as a lawyer, advocate and campaigner for over a decade and has the lived experience of being Muslim in Australia as a former refugee from Afghanistan. And Diana, I am both glad and proud to have you in this country. We're richer for it. Tonight, Diana will be discussing the consequences of the war on the people of Afghanistan. Thank you, Diana. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, Kellie. And I think I just got my video to work in time for that introduction. So thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who has would like to locate myself here. I'm calling in virtually from Naarm on the unceded stolen lands of the Wurundjeri people. East Kulin Nations, and to acknowledge all elders past and present and the traditional custodians, and that this was and always will be Aboriginal land. And I really mean that in terms of my own ancestry being forcibly displaced from Afghanistan in the early 80s and coming here as a settler. I'd like to acknowledge my own privilege in that. So thank you again for this event. I think it's really timely. I think it's really important that we maintain attention and pressure on what has ensued in the last couple of months and what will continue to happen in the following months, years, and that we do need to maintain the pressure, not just from the legal community and those who are advocates and activists, the like, but for larger Australian society to really understand that this is a huge moment in history. Our role in the intervention from the very early days, where we were, as you mentioned, Kellie, part of the US-led coalition, and in fact one of the first to put our hands up to join that 20-year intervention following 9/11, and then what has ensued since. And there is a lot here to unpack, and my role and scope is not necessarily to speak on the legalities and what has ensued, but to actually talk about the impacts, the very real impacts that it has had on not only the people of Afghanistan, but the diaspora community in turn. So, I just also like to say thank you to my esteemed panelists as well, because I'm really looking forward to hearing from them too. I guess it's important to also acknowledge that, in the last couple of months, obviously being in the diaspora community, we have different stories and narratives and experiences and migration journeys to all over the world. And the Afghan diaspora experience is not one story, and we all have very unique experiences of displacement, being refugees, migration stories, but also our own ethnic and minority status as well. So I can't speak on behalf of those who were living in Afghanistan over the last 20 years, those who lived under the Taliban in the 90s. I can't speak on the behalf of the Hazara community, who are now experiencing, a very real forced displacement project that is being undertaken by the Taliban right now in real time in provinces like Daikundi, Kandahar and Kunduz. So I can only really speak to what I'm hearing from family, from friends, my own sort of lived experience of being displaced back in the early 80s when the first wave of migrants and refugees left the country, given the sort of proxy geopolitical war and back then very clear invasion from the Russian troops. So, it has been, the last 2 months has actually taken a real emotional toll on the collective experience of the Afghan diaspora and those very much so living there. The role that the Australian government, civil society, that Australian Defence Forces played in the country can't be overlooked either. There definitely were gains made, but we can't look at this within a vacuum of what sort of the larger political context that, the Afghan people themselves have paid the highest price. Even with the targeted drones killing program from the US, what we saw under the Brereton inquiry report, which no doubt my esteemed colleague David McBride will speak to very much so. But as an international human rights lawyer, working in this space, advocating for the very real implications that intervention, that war continues to play on the very real lived realities of Afghans in the country. And over history, over the 40 years, whether it was, intervention from the Pakistan government, training, very much educating and housing the early iterations of the Taliban with their own sort of ambitions in the region. I always say this, that Afghanistan historically has been a landlocked country. So from our very location in the region with China and Russia to the north and all the stands, and we've got Pakistan and Iran on either side, we are geopolitically very unlucky, and we are reliant on our neighbours for trade routes, for ports. It's quite a complex history, but I urge people who are on the call tonight clearly have an interest in the country, have some way, shape or form been engaged, whether you're from the veteran community, whether you're from the church groups, whether you're from the Afghan diaspora here in Australia. I urge everyone to read, to understand the complex nature of the history that has ensued, but to understand that in all of it, that the very real lives of Afghans and our communities have faced the highest and paid the highest toll, whether it was and I say this with all due respect to the Australian Defence Force, You know, we've talked about the 41 lives lost of ADF personnel, but there have been countless. We actually don't have an official figure for how many Afghan lives have been lost, and consecutively, whether it was our Afghan troops, the Afghan National Guard, others under the targeted drones killings program, you know, civilian casualties from suicide bombers from the Taliban, and even just in the last few weeks and months, we don't know the casualties of Afghan lives that have been lost. So I always stress that the narrative and our lived experience need to be front and center. And I think that's really important that an Afghan voice is kicking off this event, because it shows once again the respect and the deep way that this actually continues to have a ripple effect. And I am of the generation that my parents and myself too included were refugees to this country. And if anything, it means that I'm more invested in Australia actually living up to its moral obligation because of the very real role that we played in the intervention. It's because I'm invested in this country, it's because I live, granted, on unceded stolen lands, but it's because I want to see this country do better and be better, and to pay respects to the fact that we were there, we didn't choose this war, and that there really needs to be penance, there needs to be reparations under the Brereton inquiry, there needs to be very much, you know, the criminal investigation to be, you know, referred and actually progress. We're not seeing that. It's not in the media cycles anymore. I'm not sure where the procedures are at. Maybe my esteemed colleagues can actually speak more to that, because as Afghans, we're not seeing where that's landed, nor the victims' families have received their reparations. You mentioned, Kellie, about the inquiry that is being taken forward from the Senate Department of Foreign Affairs, and also we've been engaging in that process as well as part of the Afghanistan Australian Advocacy Network, and we have been campaigning relentlessly over the last couple of months on a very real campaign to see the Australian government actually do more than talk about flaws and ceilings in terms of our additional refugee humanitarian intake. You know, people are talking about this 3,000 number. It's really important to note that that is within our existing humanitarian intake obligation, not an additional amount. Countries like the US have accepted 95,000, Canada 40,000, the UK 20,000. I've seen other countries like Kosovo even agree to take on 10,000, but Australia has not committed to an additional amount. Now that is incredibly disappointing to see, you know, and this is in addition to the existing 5,100 Afghans who are here on temporary protection visas who can't actually, there's no pathway to permanent protection for them, and they've been here for 8+ years. And that also means no family reunification. Now, if you can imagine living here for 8+ years, not having any pathway to permanent protection, that also has implications to your access to financial and income support, education, work, and just being here on your own. You know, Afghans, we are a collective, large community. Our kinship networks and our culture goes beyond that individual, very capitalistic ideas that Western societies have. Our kinship networks are large. We operate within a community. So having people here not being able to bring their families out from Afghanistan, particularly given the threat, is just so devastating. And, you know, just only last week, we saw another suicide from a young man who was here on TPV. And so the hope for them to be able to bring out their families being sort of stripped away is devastating. And that is something that the government can really make a very, very easy bureaucratic policy decision to allow them permanent protection so that they can then seek family reunification. And then obviously what we saw in the last couple of months with the evacuees coming out here, what are the supports available for them? You know, the trauma counselling that we've seen being funded, that's great. This is welcome. We really welcome this policy decision to support the settlement of newly arrived Afghans who have been evacuated from the country. But that is but a drop in the ocean. This is important that we maintain pressure, that we maintain engagement, that we actually talk about why and how we actually got here. And I think that's something that we can talk about mission creep, we can talk about moral injury from the ADF and SAS and the 20 years intervention and the very real gains that were made. But us as community are sitting back and just, you know, holding multifaceted feelings right now. You know, we don't want to live a future under the Taliban either, with the very heinous human rights and war crimes that are being committed now against minority groups, particularly women and children who aren't able to go to school or seek any sort of education, even employment, and poverty. We're not talking about, you know, before we even think about opening up humanitarian corridors, this is something that, you know, people can die of starvation. We've got winter coming up and approaching. The weather conditions are really harsh in Afghanistan. The IDPs, people, the internally displaced people who over 1 million who were fleeing regional Afghanistan for Kabul when the Taliban were encroaching those areas. We're not talking about them. So there's a lot here. And often when I do these panels, I'm like, where do I start? How much depth and knowledge do I talk to? Do I talk about Australia and the campaign? Do I talk about, you know, the way that it has affected us as a diaspora, which obviously is not comparable to those who are living in Afghanistan still with their very lives at risk? Do we talk about whether Australia should be talking about and engaging with the Taliban and legitimizing them? Like, there's just so many layers here. But I'm happy to take questions and we can engage in a conversation as well on this topic.
Thank you so much, Deanna. And there are so many questions we need to ask you, and we'll reserve those for the end. But look, IPAN is sincerely grateful that you've given us your time this evening, and truly sorry for what's happened to your country. And there were so many questions that should have been asked before we joined the US in that military incursion. But thank you very much, and we look forward to asking you questions at the end. Thank you. Our second speaker is Dr. Emma Shortis. Dr. Shortis is a research fellow at RMIT, historian and writer focused on the history and politics of the United States, and co-host of the podcast Barely Getting By. Her first book, Our Exceptional Friend, Australia's Fatal Alliance with the United States, is out now, published by Hardy Grant Books, which I've had the benefit of reading. It's an impressive attempt, in my view, to start a different conversation about our relationship with the United States and to challenge the assumption that our region must be viewed through the prism of endless suspicion. Dr. Shortis will be discussing why Australia joined the invasion in Afghanistan and Australia's relationship with the United States. Thank you, Dr. Shortis, you have the floor.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I too, of course, would like to begin by acknowledging, in my case, the people of the Woi Wurrung and Boon Wurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation, on whose unceded lands I live and work. And I respectfully acknowledge their ancestors and elders, past and present, and that sovereignty was never ceded. As Kelly said, I'm a historian, and I wanted to provide some historical context really for why Australia joined the invasion of Afghanistan and for our relationship with the United States more broadly. So as Deanna hinted at, Australia's participation in the invasion was always really framed, I think, from the beginning as an act of solidarity from Australia with the United States in the aftermath of the September 11 attacks. The Australian Prime Minister, John Howard, as you may remember, was actually in Washington, DC at the time and could see the smoke from the Pentagon from his hotel window. And in response to this, Howard invoked the ANZUS Treaty, the Australian, New Zealand, United States Security Treaty, which is the kind of centerpiece of our alliance with the United States. Howard invoked this for the very first time in his history, in its history. And when he did that, he said, he was quite passionate about it, as you remember. He said, if the ANZUS Treaty means anything, if our debt as a nation to the people of the United States means anything, if the comradeship, the friendship and the common bonds of democracy mean anything, it means that the ANZUS Treaty applies and that the ANZUS Treaty is invoked. So if we leave aside for a moment the question of the so-called kind of shared values between Australia and the United States that Howard was pointing to there, I wanted to focus on the treaty itself and why Howard felt so compelled to invoke the treaty when an invocation of this treaty was never actually required for Australia to join the United States in its invasion of Afghanistan. Most or many people, I suppose, would argue that the invocation of the treaty was about that solidarity. It was an act of symbolism. But I would argue that it's about much more. The invocation of that treaty really, I think, exposes the true nature of the alliance. And in the time that I have, I wanted to make really two related points about the true nature of that alliance and how it pertains to Australia's participation in the invasion of Afghanistan. The first, unsurprisingly, is about the centrality of war to Australia's relationship with the United States. And the second and very closely related point is about the centrality of racism to the history of that alliance, not just to ANZUS, but to the alliance and the apparatus around it more broadly. So to the first point, many of you, I think, will be well aware that the ANZUS Treaty was signed in 1951, and it was born really out of war, out of a shared experience of the Second World War between the United States and Australia. And as the kind of, I guess, popular history goes, even early in the Second World War, it became obvious that Britain, Australia's great protector, could no longer be relied upon to ensure the security of the Commonwealth in the Pacific. And so the white Australian government sought out essentially another white protector, another great protector far from our shores. The United States was actually reluctant to play this role, to give Australia this security guarantee that Australia had always had from the United Kingdom. In the end, really, the United States gave Australia the ANZUS Treaty for two reasons. It was because the United States wanted Australia to sign the peace treaty it had negotiated with Japan, which the Australian government was obstinately refusing to do. And it was also given to Australia as kind of a reward, really, for committing about 17,000 troops to the United States war in Korea. So that's why, really, Australia got ANZUS despite American reluctance. But the treaty itself has never really been enough, I think, to assuage white Australian fears about that protection. Article 4 of the ANZUS Treaty is often framed as a security guarantee for Australia, but it's nothing of the sort. It promises that the parties to the treaty will act in the event of a common danger, but it is not and will never be an ironclad security guarantee from the United States. And the Australian government knows this. It has always known that. And because of that, and because of the lessons that it drew out of the Korean War and that kind of preemptive promise of 17,000 troops to the American war effort, the historical lessons that Australian governments have taken out of that is that it's necessary to enthusiastically and almost preemptively promise enthusiastic participation in American wars, in the belief that it will shore up this not quite security guarantee, that it will prove us worthy of American protection. And it's also about, ensuring that our prime ministers will continue to get standing ovations in the United States Congress, just like John Howard did on the 12th of September in 2001. And I think we see this playing out in the invasion of Afghanistan. In current narrative, we see people quite uncritically say, I think, that the invasion and the war on terror more broadly, the moral consequences and the very real consequences for Afghanistan that Deanna talked about, are worth it for Australia and for Australians more broadly, because it does this. It proves our value to the Americans. The same was said about the Australian government's uniquely close relationship with Donald Trump and the Trump administration. We were told it was about Australian security and ensuring Australian security. And that hasn't changed in the aftermath and the continuing consequences that Deanna talked about. The moral bankruptcy of Australia's participation in them hasn't changed that mindset. It didn't change when there was a white supremacist in the White House. It didn't change after disastrous wars in Korea, disastrous wars in Vietnam or Afghanistan or Iraq. And unless that changes, unless that fear and that need to ensure American protection at almost at all costs, unless that changes, the same pattern will continue to repeat itself. And I think we can see that playing out in real time with this new so-called new alliance, this AUKUS alliance, and the positioning that it's doing towards China. So I'll just keep my eye on the time. Okay, I'm okay. The second point, and I hope you can see how deeply related this is to that question of war and the inevitability of war and our fear of war. Those fears of invasion that are the kind of represent the foundation of the ANZUS Treaty were built on this deep insecurity that I talked about that drives Australian governments to participate in these wars. Those fears are deeply racist. ANZUS was born out of racist fears of non-white invasion. And I think it's really worth pointing out, because this is often kind of not really acknowledged, that in the 1940s, fears of Japanese invasion were real and they were widespread, but without minimizing what was happening in Northern Australia, there is no evidence that the Japanese ever planned a full-scale land invasion of Australia. And by the time ANZUS was signed in 1951, there could be no argument that Japan posed that kind of threat to Australia. But that is really a foundational question, I think, for Australia. You know, as Deanna so rightly pointed out, we live in a white settler colonial country with a white settler colonial government living on stolen land, and that government and white Australians, I think, have always been afraid that that land will be stolen again by non-white countries in our region. That's really what ANZUS is about. It's about looking out into our region and being afraid of people who don't look like our white government. So when we hear talk about Australia's shared values and common heritage with the United States, it's deeply uncomfortable, but this is what we're talking about too when we talk about shared values with the United States. And in the war in Afghanistan and in the war on terror more broadly, the United States and Australia have perpetuated and they have reinforced that legacy by deliberately and systematically demonizing any and all Muslim people, the people of Afghanistan, or people who might look like they're either or both of those things. And that has been incredibly successful, I think. And the ANZUS Treaty, again, reinforces and encourages that kind of demonization, that kind of racist othering. So when we see things like Australian soldiers in Afghanistan hold up an American Confederate flag to welcome and guide American troops to a landing spot, which happened only a couple of years ago, you know, this is the Confederate flag is the quintessential symbol of American enslavement and white supremacy, and that, I think, you know, is direct and irrefutable evidence of the racist origins of the ANZUS Treaty and the alliance more broadly going forward. I think we can draw a direct line from the foundation of both of our countries through to the signing of the ANZUS Treaty in 1951, to Bush and Howard's invasion of Afghanistan and the war on terror, to an Australian white supremacist murdering people in Christchurch in New Zealand. All of these things are deeply connected. And I think until and unless something fundamental shifts in this country, until there is a reckoning and a true and honest reckoning with our own racist history and present, with our shared histories and our shared values with the United States, these two things that underpin the alliance and the ANZUS Treaty and help explain Australia's participation in the invasion of Afghanistan will remain really, I think, the future of Australia's relationship with the United States and Australia's role in the world. So with that, I will say thank you. And of course, I'm happy to take any questions, but I'll hand over to Kellie.
Thank you so much, Emma. And I am impressed with the examination in your book of the psychology behind the relationship, and I look at the structures underpinning the relationship, and this line where you say we're allowed to demand better even if we don't know exactly what better looks like. It's enough to know that it doesn't look like this. And I think that is a profound statement. And I congratulate you on your book. Friends, please put your questions in the chat box as we move to our third speaker. Don't miss the opportunity to put your questions to Deanna, Dr. Shortis and Major McBride, who we move to now. Our third speaker is Major David McBride. David is a lawyer and whistleblower, as well as a former British Army Major and an Australian Army lawyer. He's also one of my many heroes for doing his job and yet remaining principled in the face of extraordinarily significant personal consequences. So through journalists at the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, David exposed alleged murders by SAS soldiers in Afghanistan, which led to the damning Brereton report. For that, he has been charged and faces 50 years in prison, with his trial scheduled for next year, as I understand it. I will ask Sam to place a link to David's GoFundMe page, so any of us here tonight can make a contribution, however large or small, to the cost of fighting his case. I encourage you to do that if you can. I'm sure he needs and would greatly appreciate all the support he can get. David will be talking about Australia's involvement in the war in Afghanistan and war crimes. Major, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Kelly, and thank everybody for being here. I think the very best thing we can do in relation to this can of worms is to talk about it and to publicise what's going on. So every time we have a webinar like this, my heart soars because it's all we need is light on the subject, and a lot of bad things come out, and the hope for improvement. To get 300 odd people here listening is fantastic. I come from a very different approach, which is good, and I think the panel is very well weighted. It's good to have an Afghan representative. I did. It is obviously really. Well, it's not completely about the Afghan people, because we have to look at our own behaviour. It's true that they are the victims, but it's also we need to look at what we did wrong. They don't have to fix things that we do. And I think about the strategic relationship, as it's called, it's hard for me to say that with a straight face, but that is obviously the second a really big element in it, it's a really nice rounding in the panel, because I can talk about it from inside the tent. I understand the other point of views, but it's interesting to say that whichever way you look at it, it's not good. For those of you who don't know, people probably know that I'm Australian by birth. I went to university in the UK. I joined the army over there. It had everything I was looking for. Being in the army of a democratic nation, it seemed like the chance to do very good things for the world. I grew up in the sort of shadow of the Second World War. All my heroes and role models were sort of war heroes, and I joined the British Army. I went to Sandhurst, and I was very much sort of a part of the establishment. I came back to Australia. I became a lawyer. I was a barrister in Sydney, mainly doing criminal law. And again, there's a high standard of behaviour, which I took for granted. My parents were doctors. I joined the Australian Army first as a reservist, doing legal work for soldiers, and that filled a void for me because public service was important to me. And eventually, my wife at the time suggested, look, you really like doing legal work for the soldiers, and why don't you go full time? And so I did. And of course, I wanted to be the best when I got there, so I worked hard and I got the best postings, and I went to Afghanistan in 2011. I went back in 2013 with the Special Forces, which was like the pinnacle job. And so I came to it from very much inside the tent, and I saw that it was this. What alerted me to things being very wrong were small things. In that we lied. We lied about things we didn't need to lie about. And that started me on a mission to find out how far up the tree the rot went. And actually, the point while there were, the war crimes were sort of quite terrible because it was against everything that we were meant to be doing. But what was really interesting about the war crimes, and it relates to what the two earlier speakers have said, they weren't the problem. They were a symptom of a much larger problem, in that it was endemic racism, and it was a political war where everything needed to look good. So if you looked the part, if you looked like a hero, and you came back and told some story about how you'd fought off 100 Taliban, and even though the bodies looked a lot like women and children in a field, you would be believed. And that was because we wanted to have heroes. It was a bit, unfortunately, like that comedy, The Tail Wags the Dog. Heroes were created, and it was more about how good you looked, and the public affairs ran what they call public affairs. The war was increasingly run like a bad corporation, like Enron or something, where the truth didn't matter. Put out good news, because it was, and this is one of the really tragic things about it, it wasn't a failure for so many people involved in it. It was a success. George W. Bush got re-elected. That was a key point. He got with an increased majority. Nobody really questioned him. It was never, the plan was never going to work from the beginning, but that didn't matter to the electorate. And this is another factor I can talk on. One of my previous lives, one of the advantages of being old is that you've done a lot of stuff. And I was involved in politics. I hate to say it. I was in the Liberal Party. I was in the Labor Party as well before that, as you do. And but I was a candidate, and I was also in a sort of middle-ranking administrative position. And so I know I can talk with some sort of authority about the strength of polling. In the 2001 election, which was after the 9/11 attacks in 2002, but where they played that fear card, John Howard played it very well. He wasn't travelling well before the 9/11 and then Tampa. But it wasn't done on any kind of ideology. It was done on polling. So much of what you saw about the war is done. It's hideous, but and the more you look into it, the more scary it is. But they will poll people, and not obviously people like who are in this audience, but people in marginal seats, and also the worst kind of, the person who votes Labor, or the swinging voter. And they'll say, what do you think about dropping bombs in Afghanistan or whatever? And that's why we do a lot of things. It's not because anybody thinks it's going to work. It's not because anybody thinks it's a good idea, but it's because someone who may change their vote in a marginal seat, who knows very little about it, when confronted with some push polling on a subject, goes for it. It's why one of the problems we've had with the war crimes, as it's already been pointed out, I don't think there'll ever be any trials. And there won't be trials because the polling shows that so many of those kind of swinging voter types don't want to see our soldiers, go on trial. And even though it's illogical, and I've got sort of good authority, is because in the UK, when they had very strong cases, much more, it's a bigger army, but they had very strong murder cases against the British Special Forces. None of them came to trial, and even the detectives that prepared the cases were gobsmacked, because they said, we know, we're experienced detectives. We know when it's an airtight, a watertight case. They were all knocked on the head. I mean, all of them, because the Conservative government, I imagine, did polling, and polling said, you can't put these heroes on trial. And the polling is pushing, it's more important than the law, and it's more important than what's right. And that's one of the things that really concerned me, is that we have become a sort of dystopian world where we will go to war because it polls well. If you've seen that movie, Vice about Dick Cheney, it's quite, I think it's quite accurate, and it's, but one of the reasons for the war in Iraq was because they did focus groups, and people said, oh yeah, well, no one really knows who the Taliban are. It doesn't really make much sense. And but if you go to war against Iraq, you know, we hate him. Saddam Hussein, let's go to war, and it polled well. And that is increasingly what will happen. I mean, we do have a large amount of people who do vote on knee-jerk reactions. I think that's one of the main reasons why the Afghanistan war came about, because it was a vote winner. And that's one of the, and we see it even today with this AUKUS thing. We've got an election coming up. It's a vote winner. Going to war with China, it's a vote winner for a certain part of the electorate. And unfortunately, until we are able to attack that, we will always end up in wars, because unfortunately they poll well. Especially I mean, Afghanistan was fantastic because it was like central casting. You had people in black turbans, no one knew much about it. They looked like they were the, you know, bad people. And, you know, if we dropped bombs on them, you know, you were going to win votes. It's a hard fact, but true. And if we came back with heroes, this is why we created these false heroes who turned out to be false, because they look good for polling. You know, we won elections. I think one of the reasons, it's quite detailed, but in 2006, we had a very small presence in Afghanistan. Brendan Nelson was the defense minister at the time, and they sent the SAS over there, and they had a lot of shoot-ups in Afghanistan, long story short. And it looked quite heroic, a lot of rounds going down, and the pictures looked very great. At that stage, they didn't really reveal too much about the operations. A couple of things happened. They awarded some medals, one of whom to Ben Roberts-Smith, well known now, and they allowed the press to go in there. And I think that the government was very enthused by how much the press wanted to play this up, and they allowed the soldiers, which is very unusual for secret forces, to give press in conferences about the battles. And it was only after, and I assume, again, with knowledge of the Liberal Party and how it works, that polled well. And even though the chief of the Defence Force at the time said, you understand that going to Afghanistan and just shooting 50 people in the summer in the mountains of Afghanistan is not really achieving anything, because they're all going to come back next year. And in fact, if anything, they're going to come back even more. You're not going to scare Afghans by killing a few of them in each valley. Even though we knew that, we went ahead because it looked good. It looked like we were doing something. It looks like we were doing, you know, the global war on terror was a terrible development, and unfortunately people swallowed it. Because we weren't doing anything really. The idea that even when we had the drone, the idea that killing a sort of what we call a senior member of the Taliban, who was probably just a farmer who didn't like invading forces in his country, the very next day, as it would happen in our own army, he'd be replaced by someone who was looking for his job anyway. So it didn't achieve this decapitation strategy was never going to achieve anything. We knew. The terrible thing is there were plenty of people who knew it wasn't going to achieve anything. And I believe the only reason why it went ahead was because it looked good. Dropping bombs, that kill TV, the grainy closed circuit, that rated well. A lot of people, the same people who don't want Ben Roberts-Smith to go on trial, they would watch that stuff and they would love it. And for a politician, a war in a far-off country is a gift, because you just keep throwing more at it. You make speeches, you put your hand on your heart with the flag flying behind you, the Australians, and even if it goes wrong, as in Afghanistan's case, the one president who's had to suffer electorally is Biden. And he's they just kicked it down the road for 20 years. And he's the one that actually did something sensible and pulled the troops out. And of course, he's the one whose popularity suffers. So it's a very attractive prospect. And I think I really encourage those who are trying to stop the executive to be able to go straight into a war. to keep on doing it, because as long as they can, they will. Because unfortunately, the nature, and it links back into the previous speakers, we are very racist. We're a country, we took over a country ourselves, not unlike the Americans, with violence, and we put spin on it and said it wasn't like that. And so a foreign war is always a vote winner. And until it isn't, it will be used by politicians. Unfortunately, there is no rhyme and reason. There were many dissenters like myself who saw we were breaking the law. We weren't even, this is how despicable it was. We not only were we making heroes out of murderers, we were trying to put, if the political wind changed, we would try to put people who were actually just doing their own job in jail. And that was actually the first thing I discovered, in that none of what we say, the reasons we were meant to be in Afghanistan, I cringe every time I hear George W. Bush say it's all about the women and girls of Afghanistan. He couldn't care less about the women and girls of Afghanistan. But he knows that by saying that, it touches a nerve, and people kind of think. None of our said justifications were real. We were there because we wanted the Americans to like us, as previous speakers have said. That's it. That's how bad it was. We didn't change. We knew the strategy wasn't working, and we didn't do anything because we wanted the Americans to like us. Anyone like myself who said we're breaking the law, the strategy's not working, we were the ones that got shunted and put in jail because it was the emperor's new clothes, and everybody was winning elections. There was there's a money element too, which we don't have time to go into, but the contractors were making a lot of money. If you were building a road in Afghanistan, you might charge the government 100 million, because sometimes people think, well, why would we do it if it cost us so much money? Well, it didn't cost the politicians anything. In fact, it made them money. So you'd pay some contracting service to build a road. It probably only cost them 50 million to build it. They're very happy. The taxpayers paid, and then that contracting company is extremely happy with the Liberal Party or the Republican Party or whatever, and they're going to give you a big donation for your election campaign next year round. So it was a way of generating money for politicians by turning public money into private money. So everybody was kind of happy, although all the insiders like myself knew that we were lying, we were losing, we were not making progress. The reasons that we said we were there were not there. But of course, this dystopian world, it was the dissenters who were shut up. And what we really need now is some sort of accountability to say, look, this went very badly. This went, however way you look at it, it went badly. And that's why, in some ways, I was very grateful to see the whole thing collapse in a heap in August, because it was a visual display to show what a complete stuff up it was. And that people had been lying all along, and it was the emperor's new clothes. And we need to actually look into that. It's not the end of the world. It will be the end of the world if we don't change our ways and we end up in another war, probably, or even just posturing for another war with the same people running the same PR campaign, trying to get those unsophisticated voters to thinking that they are protecting Australia, but actually we're making us far less safe. Because as a professional soldier, what made me most angry is it didn't even work. It wasn't like we were doing some sort of sneaky plan, which was a little bit, off color, but, we really beat the enemy. I mean, we went backwards. It failed on every level, and there needs to be some sort of accountability. And I'm glad that we're all, there's so many submissions to the Senate inquiry, because we would do a disservice to Australia if we didn't look into all of those issues now. And I'll leave it there. I'll take some questions, well, if they're asked.
Thank you, David. And I must say I'm interested in that conflict that you must have experienced between conformity and doing the right thing, and whether you had that deep belief that when you made the original complaint that the system would deal with it appropriately, and whether that faith was lost, or whether you ever had that faith and just went through the motions. So perhaps that's something that you can touch on in the question period of time. I've noticed there are some questions, but I'd really like to start Deanna off with a question, because I can see a lot of comments, not a lot of questions. So please get those questions in. Deanna, what did our political leaders not understand about your country, Afghanistan, both before the military incursion and subsequent to it? And would you care to talk to the legality of the invasion, which seems to have been misconstrued as being a legal military intervention, as they call it?
Yeah, thank you, Kellie. And before I answer that question, I just wanted to address a couple of the points that Emma and Major McBride mentioned around who we are as a nation and who we want to be in terms of this idea, this mythology that we've crafted over since Federation and our initial period of colonization, and, you know, in all honesty, the genocide that has been committed on First Nations communities. And I just want to also make it clear that I am Afghan, absolutely, but I'm also an international human rights lawyer who's been advocating and campaigning on these issues for over a decade. And I've campaigned on the war, our intervention, and our role that we played in Syria and Iraq, and the drones that were committed, the drones campaigns that we committed, allegations of war crimes in Raqqa, very much so. The fact under Christopher Pyne, he was industry experts minister when we were courting the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia when they were engaging in war crimes in Yemen. The fact that under Defence Minister Maurice Payne, we were continuing to train the Myanmar military during the Rohingya genocide and ethnic cleansing campaign. The fact that, you know, we witnessed I know Major McBride, you must have similar parallels as being a whistleblower, and what happened with East Timor and the region there during the leaks around the sea and the pipelines and the gas exploration and all of that. For me, Afghanistan and what we witnessed over the last 20 years is but another example of Australia's very violent colonial project and settler colony that we are founded on. And this is a continuum of that violence. And I want to just make really clear to those people on the call today that I'm not just here as an Afghan, and I just want to be really clear that that is part of my identity, but I've dedicated my life to this work, to lobbying and advocating and campaigning for Australia to do better and be better. And this idea and notion that we have that deep insecurity, as you mentioned, Dr. Shortis, and that's very much created this mentality of us in the Asia Pacific region that we refuse to acknowledge that our closest neighbor is Indonesia, the world's largest Islamic democracy. Yet we don't acknowledge that that is a neighbor, a partner, an ally. This idea of white supremacy and our white Australia policy is very really embedded in our psyche. And this idea of white supremacy infiltrates into very real institutionalized ways and racism. And I'm so glad that my other co-panelists who are white brought that up first, because I feel like sometimes when I talk about racism, I talk about whiteness, I talk about institutionalized racism, this settler colony that we live on and the colonial project, it is designed and doing exactly what it was meant to since day dot. And the very real erasure and the lack of truth telling from that predicate has sort of informed our history. And so I am but one of the victims of this intervention imperialist global agenda that we have allied ourselves with the US and what we're now doing, and very real building on that xenophobia, the Islamophobia, the othering and dehumanizing of us as very real people. And I sit here and I try to have to command some level of respect because for some reason, the reductivist and the flattening of me as just an Afghan on the panel, I find really offensive, because I'm so much more than that. And I constantly have to justify that. So I just want to be really clear that Australia has so much reckoning to do about our moral and very real imperative for us at this moment in history to do better on Afghanistan. Absolutely, 100%, unequivocally. But this has to inform our future. And you know, Major McBride, you know, seeing what happened in the last few months, yes, the very lies and the way that the evacuation played out, you know, for those who played a role in the whistleblowing, we respect that deeply in the Brereton inquiry, but the very real lives of Afghans, again, in those images that circulated, that it didn't have to be this way. It didn't. Like with anything, yes, the ball was kicked down the line and Biden had to, you know, shoulder all that Trump, you know, the so-called peace agreement that was made with the Taliban in Doha in January 2020, that Biden just sort of had to close the deal on. It didn't have to be this way. It didn't. And again, Afghan lives and the evacuation and those mercy flights and, you know, privileging those military leaders holding those babies, they, you know, that was what the media was portraying. And I also hold the media and the Fourth Estate equally culpable for the role that they played. And that liberal war cry around saving Afghan women and children. If you've ever met an Afghan woman, and I'm but one, we don't need your saving, we need your solidarity, and we need you to get out of our way, because we have agency and we want to self-determine and govern our own lives. So I just really wanted to get that out. Anyway, so back to your question at hand around the intervention. Absolutely, and that comes back to 9/11. You know, again, if John Howard was there witnessing the smoke coming out of the Pentagon in Washington, DC, it was an emotional reaction. It was also the rhetoric that was coming out around Osama bin Laden. He was not Afghan. He was from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. He was housed, he was trained, he was building the Al-Qaeda was having a base there because of the power vacuum that was left from generations of the proxy war from the Cold War era, where the Mujahideen were again funded and trained and backed by the US. So I just urge people to not see these things. There's a whole complex history behind it. And again, it is about the systems and who is playing the puppet strings and who is gaining from this. The war profiteering was horrendous. My cousin, Fariba Nawar, wrote a book called Afghanistan Inc. and Iraq Inc. was another one about the war profiteering. It's very lucrative. It's incredibly lucrative to go to war. And this is the problem that we have. And, you know, based off that, and you know, 9/11 happened, that's the 11th of September, and by the 22nd of October, Australia had troops on the ground. That was less than a month. We had, you know, this coalition of the willing under it triggered up Chapter 7, the UN Security Council, you know, green lighted this. So I do worry about the future of us warmongering, the role of the media in that, what's happening now with China, particularly on the back of all the racism of the global pandemic and COVID-19. I worry that Australia can help try to demonize China in this era, but yet stays silent on the Uyghurs and the very real re-education concentration camps that is happening with the Uyghur population in East Turkestan. So why are they silent on that? Why aren't they doing enough on that? You know, human rights become a bargaining chip when and if it serves this narrative of going to war. So I worry about the lack of criticality. I worry about our media not being discerning and feeding and enabling war and the war crimes that were committed. And, you know, I'm very grateful for the Brereton inquiry because it revealed a very deep culture of ego, elitism and entitlement, but that is peak whiteness, peak white toxic masculinity that we see here in Australia every week. And, you know, living on a violent settler colony, I work in domestic and family violence as well, and we see more than one woman a week dying at the hands of intimate partner violence. It's all part of that same continuum of violence. So we have to reckon with our history. We cannot have justice, without accountability. We can no longer rest on our laurels, because we're seeing our tertiary academic institutions being absolutely gutted during COVID. So what does that mean for the future of us being discerning and having that critical lens on the war, on our treaties? Who do we want to be? So I just, there's a lot in that question. Sorry, Kellie, but I just was a little bit triggered.
I'm pleased you said it all.
Yeah, I was just, as an Afghan, like, we're still experiencing a lot of trauma. So
Absolutely.
when people make light or make comments about the evacuation, and people with very real lives, and those who are living and it's still there, like, it actually is devastating for us, and we haven't recovered, nor will we recover for a while yet. And I do this work every day. This is my other job. I have 2 other jobs, so us as the community, we're really carrying so much of this at the moment.
I appreciate your comments, Sienna, and we will make mention of your petition at the end. I'm very mindful of the time, but it's important to get a plug in for that, because if we can draw as many people to signing that as soon as possible, I'm sure, it's in the best interests of everybody. I have a quick question for Emma. Could we argue that ANZUS treaty, someone has just moved it, I'll just get it back. I'm sorry, Emma. Everyone's suddenly had a question. Could we argue that ANZUS treaty has been repeatedly violated because it refers several times to the need for international peace and security and the role of the UN, not the US, in maintaining it?
Okay, that's a good question. I mean, I'd start by saying that I'm not an international lawyer. I'm a historian, so I can't speak specifically to the legality of those treaties. What I would say as a historian and as somebody who watches the US in the world quite closely is that those kind of treaties that are constructed by the United States, indeed the international political system in which we operate, and the so-called liberal rules-based international order, was constructed by the United States to suit the United States. And so that's the reflection, I think, that we see all of the time in international law. The United States can violate international law consistently. It does so consistently because there are no consequences for that violation for American power. And so, maybe if we're looking at the kind of letter of the law of international law, ANZUS has been violated in that it isn't upholding peace and security, but it's easy enough for proponents of ANZUS to argue that it has ensured peace and security. That's constantly what we're told, that ANZUS is central to peace and security, or a free and open Indo-Pacific. We hear that all of the time. I suppose my concern is with the kind of broader moral implications of ANZUS and what it makes us do and the function that it has in our political system. And saying that it has been violated, even if that's true, I don't think is going to change the fundamental of that, not only that treaty, but the broader kind of architecture of the international political system, of which it's a really important part.
Thank you, Emma. David, we have a question for you. Can you explain how the chain of command operates between the Australian military and the US military in Afghanistan? Do Australian forces have any autonomy, or do they fulfill the US military objectives? If I could just tack on my question about the conflict that you felt at the time of making your complaint. So that conflict between conformity and silence and obviously doing the right thing.
Yeah, it's a good question about the chain of command. And the chain of command, it reminded me a bit of some of the things that have gone on in relation to the COVID chain of command, where they try to work out with inquiries as to who actually made a certain decision. In that if something went well, everybody tried to take credit, but if something went wrong, it was everybody else's fault. The Australians were we are completely controlled by the Americans now. We don't actually have a defence force which is capable of protecting Australia in any kind of way, shape or form. So, and when we were in Afghanistan, we were there. We were only there because we were using American helicopters. We were using, the Americans were feeding us. The Americans we were almost what they call embeds, in that we were Australians in the American arm. Saying that, it was our lot. We could have complained more. There's no excuse for us not saying the tactics are not working. We need to change. So Australia needs to. We can't get out of responsibility for it going so wrong, because we knew and we said nothing, and that complicity is obviously enough to make us guilty. And it's a real problem. We now, with Five Eyes, we are now effectively part of America. As far as foreign policy goes, that's why Julian Assange is going to go to prison. The Americans are involved in my own case. For foreign affairs now, it's complicated to explain why, but because we're now part of Five Eyes, we are really all the same country, and it's not a committee. The Americans are in charge, and we do whatever they say. But in relation to your question, Kellie, it was disappointing. I saw something which I'll have to explain in my book. On my tour with the Special Forces, I had a lot of hints that things were very wrong. But on my tour with the Special, I saw something, and with all my specialist knowledge, I knew then that things were so wrong, and it went all the way back to the White House. You know, it was an unbroken link. But I also did hope that there would be some people in the Australian military who might, because it was about the law, if nothing else. I had something pretty strong to hang my, hat on. And I did think that someone in Australia would give me it wouldn't have to take too many layers before someone gave me a pat on the back and said, "You've done the right thing for bringing this to our attention." What was depressing was that how far up the chain, there may have been people, I'm sure if I'm successful, plenty of people will come out and go, "I was rooting for you. Yeah, but I was right. Yeah, I was just about to step up myself." But you could beat me to it, so I didn't bother. There'll probably be plenty of that. And if I go to jail forever, everyone will go like, "Well, I never knew that guy." But it was pretty silent. I could not find anybody, and that was quite scary. I went to the police, and they were like, "You misunderstand. We don't work for the law. Basically, we work for the government." And everybody had the attitude of the government wants to do something, and the government can just do it. And that was quite scary. And if the Americans want us to do something, we just do it. So I realized I was pretty much on my own, and that was I didn't expect that. For someone who grew up very much establishment, very much thinking, and my father was a whistleblower, I did think that I was going to get a pat on the back a little bit early. I'm still hoping the judiciary will do that. But our country is in a bad way, and most of the public servants, the police, they're not interested in actually ensuring that the law is followed. Everybody seems to think they work for the government. I mean, that is the reigning political party, and the law is just something which we window dress, like Afghan women and girls. That's just something you say you follow. But you follow orders, which is quite worrying. And I hope that if we can change that, because the law is enough. If we followed the law in Australia and we got rid of the so-called strategic alliance, everything would be all right. We don't necessarily need to remake, the whole country. I mean, if we had reparations for genocide, if we did that's all we need. We need an ICAC. We need. But the law is enough if we start applying it in good ways, like Mabo. And I think it's someone mentioned reparations. I think reparations would be a very important step to Afghanistan. And I think even apologies would go down well. It would just say, we understand we made mistakes. People can accept that, but we need to accept when someone needs to say that. My case will be interesting because we're on a head-on collision, and someone's going to have to admit that they were wrong. Either I'm going to go to jail forever, or someone's going to say, "Yeah, look, there's something wrong with the country." And I guess we're going to find out next year in the final showdown.
And I hope, David, and I speak on behalf of many, I'm sure, that come what may, that fate will push you towards a political career, and because Canberra needs a whole lot of independent, honest dissenters who will do the right thing by voters, and I would certainly cast a vote in your favour. And we appreciate everything you've done and understand the personal consequences you've faced, and couldn't be more proud to call you Australian, and it's just an honour to meet you. And on that basis, I noticed that it's 7:06. I've got a few plugs for petitions, and I know the panellists have other commitments, but I'm being honoured to be in their company this evening. They're 3 incredible Australians doing such splendid work, and I thank IPAN too, because without IPAN, this would not have been possible. So the petitions, while I've got everyone's attention, I don't know if you can see me, but there are several petitions. You can jump on now and sign them. The first one is the Action for Afghanistan. Sam will put the link up in the chat. You can join over 155,000 other people to support the Afghan people, particularly in light of the information provided by Deanna this evening. And that's www.actionforafghanistan.com.au. We have the IPAN petition, No Nuclear Submarines, End US Dominance, Healthcare, Not Warfare, I should say. It's got a very long link, but you will find it in the chat. You've got David's GoFundMe. It's a very long link, but again, it will be made available to you. That's something that I need to contribute to this evening, David. Legal expertise does not come cheaply, and your case is not far away, so we need to support you as much as we can. I think that's all of the petitions that I need to deal with, and on that note, I thank friends for joining us. Let's hope this is the first of many conversations we'll have on these important subjects. You know, our foreign policy certainly needs close examination, and our defence position is certainly drawing a lot of interest, particularly from the good work of AWPR and IPAN and others. So on that note, I thank you. Enjoy your evening, and let's talk again. Thank you.
Thank you, Kellie and IPAN. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks all.